Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a new episode of our Letter to Voxes podcast. Today, we are plunging into, well, what might be the deepest, most rigorously structured ocean in all of philosophy, the moral and theoretical universe designed by Immanuel Kant.
Indeed, we're taking a deep dive into a philosophical system that is so monolithic, so profound, that it really, you could say it created the groundwork for much of modern Western thought.
And we're going to be focusing on the core of his critical philosophy, looking at that tension between his critique of pure reason and the critique of practical reason.
Right.
So our mission for you today is to get a quick, but also a truly thorough understanding of the core concepts that define Kant's influence. I mean, from the absolute limits he placed on what we can even know, all the way to the revolutionary demands of his moral law.
We want to give you the essential roadmap, way through the critical philosophy that's detailed enough to be accurate, but without getting completely tangled up in all the dense academic jargon.
Okay, so to really appreciate the revolution, I think we need to know the man behind it, Immanuel Kant.
Absolutely. He was born and raised in Königsberg, and he lived this remarkably routine life. It's famously said that his neighbors could set their watches by his afternoon walk.
The same path, same time, every single day.
Every single day. And while we often associate him with these incredible works he published late in life, it's important to remember he was already an established, highly influential scholar by the age of 46.
Right, his pre-critical works, they're getting a lot more attention now, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
Scholars are seeing more continuity.
They really are, which makes his eventual breakthrough even more dramatic. His greatest works, starting with the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, came after this famous decade of intellectual silence.
He was just thinking.
Thinking and genuinely resisting change. There's this fantastic quote from a letter he wrote in 1778. He says, "Any change makes me apprehensive. I must take heed if I wish that the threads which the fates spin so thin and weak in my case to be spun to any length."
Wow. So this cautious, routine-bound man is the one who delivers one of the most intellectually disruptive systems in history.
And that disruption was really spurred by a moment of profound doubt, which was triggered by the Scottish empiricist David Hume.
Ah, the famous dogmatic slumber.
Exactly. Kant famously credited Hume with awakening him from his dogmatic slumber. Before Hume, rationalist philosophy just sort of took for granted that concepts like causality were certain.
We just knew that every effect has a cause.
Right, but Hume comes along and says, well, do we? He argued we never actually experience causality. We only see one event constantly followed by another. Causality itself is just a psychological habit we project onto the world.
That is a destructive skepticism. If causality is just a habit, then what happens to scientific laws? To any kind of universal certainty?
Precisely, and this is what forced Kant's hand. He had to find a new way to ground universal necessary knowledge. He had to counter Hume by showing that some foundational structure for experience must exist in the mind itself before any observation.
And that's the quest that leads to the Critique of Pure Reason.
That's the one. It threw philosophy into complete disarray and really established the foundation for everything that followed.
Okay, so let's unpack that first great intellectual move. Kant's so-called Copernican revolution in philosophy.
Right. It completely flips the script on the relationship between, the observer and the observed.
For millennia, the assumption was that our knowledge has to somehow align with or conform to objects as they exist out there in the world.
Exactly. We try to align our mind to the world, but Kant argued that this approach just leads to an impasse. It can't explain how we have necessary universal knowledge, like mathematics or physics, if everything we know comes from fleeting contingent experience.
So his revolution is, what if we have it backwards?
Precisely. He says we must assume the reverse, that objects must conform to the structure of our mind.
So the mind isn't just a passive receiver of reality. It's actively organizing it, shaping it.
That's the core of his transcendental idealism. He posits that we have these inherent necessary structures built into our minds, and the most fundamental of these are space and time.
So space and time aren't features of the world that exist independently of us.
Not according to Kant. He argues they are forms of intuition, or Anschauung. They're the a priori framework, the lenses that we must use to process any sensory experience at all.
So if space and time are our built-in lenses, then everything we experience is being filtered through them.
And that sets a profound, and for Kant, a permanent limitation on our theoretical knowledge. Since we can only ever know things as they appear to us under these conditions, the objects of our experience are only appearances. or what he calls phenomena.
Which means the nature of things as they are in themselves.
The thing in itself, or the noumenon.
It's fundamentally unknowable to us. That is a huge epistemological limitation.
Yeah.
And it's been causing controversy for centuries.
A huge debate. When Kant says the noumenon is unknowable, what does he really mean? Is it some separate, inaccessible reality? Or is it just the same object but considered in a different way?
The two-world view would say it's a separate ontological domain, right? The thing in itself is literally not the chair I'm sitting on. It's in some other realm that I can't access.
That's one interpretation. But the two-aspect view, which many scholars favor, is a bit subtler. It suggests that the thing in itself isn't a separate place, but a different way of considering the same object.
So the table in front of me, as I see it in space and time, is a phenomenon.
Right, but the table, considered abstractly, completely free of my subjective filtering of space and time, that's the noumenon.
But either way you slice it, the result for human knowledge is the same. We are stuck in the phenomenal world. Our theoretical knowledge hits a hard boundary.
A permanent boundary. And that boundary directly answers the central question of the whole critique of pure reason. How are synthetic judgments a priori possible?
Okay, this is where it gets dense. We need to slow down and define these terms, because they are the scaffolding for the whole thing.
Absolutely. A judgment is just a statement connecting a subject and a predicate. Kant first categorizes them by their content.
So analytic versus synthetic.
Exactly. An analytic judgment is where the predicate is already contained in the concept of the subject. It's true by definition. All bachelors are unmarried. It doesn't add any new knowledge.
And all analytic judgments are a priori, known before experience.
Correct. A synthetic judgment, on the other hand, adds new information. It expands our knowledge. This specific body is heavy. Most of our observations about the world are synthetic.
Okay, so that's content. Then there's the second categorization, which is by their source.
Right. A posteriori judgments are derived from experience. They're contingent. It is raining now. A priori judgments are independent of experience. They're universal and necessary, like mathematical laws.
So when Kant asks, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? He's asking,
how can we acquire knowledge that actually expands our understanding of the world, so it's synthetic, but is also guaranteed to be universally true and necessary, so it's a priori, without us ever having to test every single instance?
Can you give me a classic example of this in action?
Mathematics is his go-to case. Take the equation 7 plus 5 equals 12. The concept of 12 isn't actually contained in the concept of 7 plus 5.
You have to do something.
You have to perform a mental act of synthesis. You have to move forward in time or count in space to get the result. So it's synthetic, it expands your knowledge, but it's also a priori because its truth is necessary and universal. It doesn't depend on you counting 7 apples and 5 apples.
So the mind itself supplies the structure, the pure forms of time and space, that makes the operation possible and guarantees its universal truth.
That's it. Which brings us to one of his most elegant lines. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind.
You need both.
You absolutely need both. Intuitions are the raw sensory data, the stuff of sensation. But if you only have intuitions without concepts like substance or causality, your experience is blind. It's just a booming, buzzing confusion with no organization.
And the other way around, if you only have concepts but no sensory input to apply them to, those thoughts are just empty. They can't generate any real knowledge about the world.
Exactly. So the whole project is a kind of intellectual map-making. Kant is establishing the legitimate territory of knowledge and drawing the line for how far reason can go without empirical input.
And this is where he turns from builder to demolition expert, the transcendental dialectic. This is where he shows how reason goes wrong when it crosses that line.
It's a natural tendency. Reason has this inherent, inescapable drive to unify everything. It wants a complete systematic whole. And that drive pushes it beyond the boundaries of possible experience into a realm where there's no sensory data.
And that leads to what he calls transcendental illusion.
Yes. The belief that the subjective principles that govern our own understanding are actually objective principles that describe things in themselves.
It's a philosophical gravity well. We can't help asking these big questions, even if we can't answer them.
Yeah.
So what are the big metaphysical ideas that Kant says are just illusions?
They arise when the categories of relation substance, causality, community are stretched beyond the phenomenal world. This gives us the 3 great ideas of rationalist metaphysics.
Which are?
First, the soul. This comes from extending the idea of substance. Reason tries to think of the self as an ultimate, simple, immortal thing. Kant argues you can't do that. Second, The world in its entirety. This comes from extending causality, trying to imagine the complete, absolute causal series of the universe. And third, God, which arises from extending community, trying to conceive of a necessary being as the ground of all possibilities.
And his most dramatic demonstration of reason's failure here is the antinomies. This is where reason basically starts fighting with itself.
It really is. In the antinomies, Kant shows that when reason asks questions about the unconditioned totality of the world, it can prove two completely opposing theses with equally strong arguments. It's a perfect stalemate, proving reason is out of its depth.
What are the antinomies?
There are four. The first two, the mathematical ones, deal with quantity. Reason can prove that the universe is both finite and infinite in space and time, and that matter both is and is not infinitely divisible.
So total contradiction. And what about the other two?
The dynamical antinomies. These are about relational forces. The third one proves that the world contains causes that are both free, unconditioned, and that there's absolutely no freedom, with everything determined by natural laws.
And that is the pivotal one. That's the clash between freedom and determinism.
The absolute core of the problem. And the fourth antinomy proves that there both is and is not a necessary being like God in the world.
So that third antinomy, theoretical reason, shows us that everything we experience in the phenomenal world in time must be determined by a preceding cause.
Yes, a strict causal chain.
But at the same time, our entire concept of morality and responsibility seems to require transcendental freedom, the ability to start a new causal chain, unconditioned by the past.
And this is Kant's brilliant theoretical move. The critique of pure reason doesn't prove freedom is real, but by showing that causal determinism only applies to the phenomenal world of appearances, it makes freedom something that is not impossible to think.
So carves out a logical space for freedom.
Exactly. We can think of ourselves as being determined as an appearance in time, but potentially free as a noumenon outside of time. The first critique opened the door so that the second critique could walk through it and prove freedom's reality on practical grounds.
Okay, so if theoretical reason sets the boundaries on what we can know, the second critique, the critique of practical reason, is designed to show us what we must do.
And in doing so, it provides the only path to affirming what lies beyond those theoretical limits.
There's a subtle but important distinction in the title, right? It's not a critique of pure practical reason.
That's right. It's a critique of practical reason generally. Because Kant believed that if pure practical reason exists, if reason alone can determine the will, without any help from desires, then it doesn't need a critique. It's the standard itself.
So he's critiquing the idea that our practical reason is only ever driven by our desires and feelings.
He's critiquing the empirically conditioned practical reason to show that a pure version is not only possible, but real.
And the will is at the center of all this. How does he define the will?
Essentially, it's a causal power particular to rational agents. It's our capacity to act according to our representation of laws or principles. He sometimes even equates it directly with practical reason itself. It's our ability to choose based on principles, not just on instinct.
So the big question for the second critique is, can reason determine the will all by itself? Or is it always, as Hume famously argued, just the slave of the passions?
That's the showdown. Kant argues that any moral system based on desires, feelings, or preferences, what he lumps together as material practical principles, is doomed to fail.
What's a material principle?
It's any principle that presupposes an object of the faculty of desire as the determining ground of the will. Basically, your choice is grounded in some external object or feeling that promises you pleasure or satisfaction.
So if I act kindly because it makes me feel good, or because I want people to think I'm a kind person, that's a material principle.
Exactly. And because desire and pleasure are empirical, they're subjective, they change, you only know them through feeling, they can never provide the universally necessary objective moral laws that morality demands.
So even things that sound good, like pursuing perfection or moral feeling, or even obeying God's will, if the reason you're doing it is for a reward, like happiness or getting into heaven, it's material. It fails the test.
It fails the test. Take happiness. It seems like a good goal, but Kant argues that making universal happiness the objective moral law would be a disaster. It would lead to the worst conflict.
Why?
Because everyone's idea of happiness is different. It's based on subjective changing feelings. Trying to create a universal law of happiness would be impossible, and the exceptions you'd have to make would be endless. It would create the most extreme opposite of harmony.
So morality has to be stripped of all that. It has to be necessary, objective, universal. Independent of desire or consequence, it needs a formal law.
A law based on the mere form of universal law-giving itself. And this leads directly to the sole principle of morality, autonomy.
Autonomy, the capacity for self-rule.
Yes. For Kant, it's a two-part concept. First, it's independence from the matter of the law, that's negative freedom, not being pushed around by your inclinations. And second, it's the self-legislation of pure practical reason, that's positive freedom. The rational being gives the moral law to itself.
And if you don't do that, if you let your desire for happiness determine your will, that's what he calls.
Heteronomy. Dependence on natural law, on impulse, on inclination. Only the autonomous will is a truly moral will.
And this foundational law that the autonomous will gives to itself is the categorical imperative.
The unconditional command of reason. Kant gives us three main formulations, which he saw as different ways of saying the same thing.
Let's start with the first one, the formula of universal law.
Act only in accordance with that maxim through which you at the same time can will that it become a universal law.
So it's a test.
It's a consistency test. When you decide to act, you create a maxim, a personal rule. The test is, can you rationally and consistently will for that personal rule to become a law that everybody has to follow all the time without it blowing up in your face?
Let's use his famous example, the lying promise. I need money, so my maxim is, when I need money, I'll borrow it and promise to pay it back, even though I know I never can.
Okay, now universalize it. Imagine a world where everyone lives by that rule. What happens to the institution of promising itself?
It collapses. No one would trust a promise, so you couldn't even make one in the first place.
Exactly. The maxim destroys itself when it's universalized. That's what he calls a contradiction in conception.
But what about maxims that don't self-destruct but still seem wrong? Like, I will never help anyone in need. The world could still exist if everyone did that. It would just be a terrible place.
Right. And that's where the second, subtler test comes in. The contradiction in will. You can conceive of a world where no one helps anyone else. But could you, as a rational being, consistently will for that world to exist?
No, because I know that at some point, I'm going to need help myself.
Precisely. So your will would contradict itself. You'd be willing a world in which you wouldn't get the help you know you will inevitably need.
This seems to lead directly to the second major formulation, the formula of humanity as end in itself.
So acts that you use humanity as much in your own person as in the person of every other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. This is maybe the most influential Kantian idea in all of modern ethics.
And the idea here is that because every rational being is autonomous, capable of giving themselves the law, they possess an absolute unconditional worth, a dignity.
Yes. You can treat a cashier as a means to buy groceries, but you must also always respect them as an end in themselves, recognizing their inherent dignity and their own rational projects. You can never treat a person merely as a tool.
So lying to someone is a perfect example of treating them as a mere means.
It is. You're bypassing their rational capacity to freely consent to your plan. You're manipulating them, reducing them to an object for your own purposes.
And the third formulation sort of ties the first two together, right? The formula of the realm of ends.
It does. It asks us to imagine ourselves as both citizen and legislator in a possible moral commonwealth, a realm of ends. It's a community of autonomous beings who all treat each other as ends in themselves and all live under the same universal laws that they themselves have created.
Okay, so the moral law is established, but now we have to go back to that huge problem from the third antinomy. How is freedom, this causality that's independent of nature and time, how is it actually possible?
This is the keystone that holds the entire arch of his system together. Theoretical reason could only say that freedom wasn't a logical contradiction. But the second critique claims it can prove freedom's objective reality.
And it does this through the moral law itself.
Through a reciprocal relationship. Kant says that freedom and unconditional practical law reciprocally imply each other. Freedom is the ratio ascendi of the moral law. It's the condition of its being. You couldn't have a moral law if you weren't free.
But the moral law is the ratio cognoscendi of freedom.
It's how we know we're free. It's only through our awareness of the moral law's binding command, you ought to do this, therefore you can, that we become aware of our own freedom.
But isn't calling this the fact of reason just a bit of a cop-out? It sounds a little circular. I know I'm free because I feel the law, and I know the law is real because I'm free.
That's the crucial objection. But Kant would say it's not a theoretical proof, and it's not a feeling. It's an immediate, undeniable awareness of the moral law's authority. It's a fact of reason in the sense that it's a determination of our will that we just can't escape. It's firmly rooted in ordinary thought and experience.
So the proof is in the pudding, so to speak.
Yeah.
My ability to even recognize an action as my duty and to choose to do it even when every one of my desires is screaming no, that is the proof.
That capacity is transcendental freedom in action. It discloses our ability to act independently of all empirical conditions.
But I'm still struggling with the clash with the mechanism of nature. If our actions are events in time, and every event in time is causally determined, how can we genuinely say a person could have acted otherwise?
This is the heart of the problem. And Kant says if we assume that our temporal existence is all there is to us, that we are only phenomena, then freedom and necessity are totally contradictory. Every action is just the inevitable result of a causal chain stretching back to the beginning of time.
So we're never really free in the moment of choice.
Not in that view, and this is why Kant absolutely demolishes what he calls comparative freedom. He calls it a wretched subterfuge.
What's comparative freedom?
It's the weak idea that you're free just because the cause of your action is internal to you, like a thought or a desire. Kant compares this to a clock whose hands move from within.
Ah, the famous turnspit analogy.
The turnspit analogy. If our freedom were merely psychological, where our actions are determined by preceding thoughts or representations in time, we would be nothing better than the freedom of a turnspit, which, once it is wound up, also accomplishes its movements of itself.
That is a brutal takedown. So psychological freedom isn't real freedom, it's just complex clockwork.
It's just very complex clockwork.
Yeah.
And without true transcendental freedom independence from the entire empirical order, there's no moral law and no real responsibility. The resolution has to rely on that distinction we made earlier.
The dual nature of the self, as phenomenon and noumenon.
Exactly. The action, as an event in the sensible world, is part of the necessary causal chain, but the choice to adopt the maxim that leads to the action that originates in the timeless noumenal self, the intelligible self.
So the same subject is determined under the laws of nature, but is the free first cause of the action when considered as a thing in itself.
And this isn't just a philosophical trick. We experience this reality through conscience. Think of his example of the criminal. The criminal might try to rationalize their crime, blame their upbringing, say they were carried away by the stream of natural necessity.
But their inner prosecutor, their conscience, condemns them anyway.
It can't be silenced, because they know that at the time of the act, they had the use of their freedom. They know they could have chosen otherwise. This is also why repentance for something done long ago is a legitimate feeling.
Because reason, in the noumenal realm, doesn't recognize the distinction of time. The act belongs to the timeless character of the free self.
Exactly.
So how does this purely rational moral law actually motivate us? If it's not based on desire, what's the incentive?
This is a critical point. The moral law's first effect on us is actually negative. It has to unavoidably humiliate every human being.
Humiliate? That sounds pretty harsh. What is it humiliating?
It's humiliating our self-conceit. Eigenmuckle. Kant makes a key distinction between that and simple self-love, which is just the natural tendency to care about our own inclinations. Self-conceit is much worse. It's the arrogance of making that self-love the primary lawgiver, acting as if our desires should dictate reality.
So the moral law just smashes that arrogance.
It knocks it down.
Yeah.
And this negative effect, this painful removal of the hindrance of self-conceit, is what produces the only truly moral feeling.
And that is respect for the moral law.
Yes, a feeling produced by an intellectual ground. It's not a feeling that leads us to morality. It's the feeling that results from our rational recognition of the moral law's supreme authority over all our selfish impulses. It's the only feeling we can know completely a priori.
It's the conscious recognition of objective dignity in the law and in ourselves. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoyed this podcast.
So having established the moral law and the fact of freedom, we get to the dialectic of pure practical reason, which addresses the ultimate goal of all our moral striving, to produce the highest good in the world. This is the necessary object of a will that's determined by the moral law.
Okay, what exactly is the highest good?
It's a state where virtue and happiness are necessarily combined. Specifically, where happiness is distributed in exact proportion to virtue, the perfect union of moral worth and well-being.
Wait a minute. This sounds like we're right back in a contradiction. We just spent all this time arguing that morality can't be based on seeking happiness. Now you're saying the ultimate goal of morality includes happiness.
You've hit on the antinomy of practical reason. The contradiction arises immediately. On one hand, the pursuit of virtue cannot be motivated by the desire for happiness. That would be heteronomy. On the other hand, in the real world, being virtuous provides absolutely no guarantee of being happy. The laws of nature don't care about your moral character.
So the highest good seems impossible to achieve. And if the necessary object of the moral law is impossible, then the law itself must be fantastic and directed to empty imaginary ends. It would basically mean the whole system is a failure.
Correct. So, to save the rationality of duty, which is unconditional, Kant argues we must postulate certain metaphysical conditions that make the highest good a real possibility. We have to assume certain things are true, not because we can know them theoretically, but because we must believe them for morality to make sense.
And the first of these postulates is the immortality of the soul.
Yes. The moral law commands us to achieve holiness, complete conformity of our will with the law. But that's a state of perfection no finite being can ever achieve at any single moment in time. So it demands an endless progress toward that perfection.
And endless progress is only possible if we assume our existence continues endlessly.
Exactly. We have to presuppose the immortality of the soul to make sense of the command to become perfectly moral.
So that's the first postulate. What's the second?
The second is the existence of God. This is needed to solve the other half of the antinomy, the disconnect between virtue and happiness, since the laws of nature and the laws of morality are two independent systems.
We need some kind of higher power to coordinate them, to make sure that virtue is eventually rewarded with proportional happiness.
We need to assume a moral author of the universe who is capable of harmonizing those two realms, and the moral law itself tells us what this being must be like: omniscient, to know our innermost moral dispositions; omnipotent, to arrange the world accordingly; and eternal.
This is really where Kant destroys knowledge to make room for faith. Freedom, God, and immortality are the practical postulates.
They are. They are theoretical propositions that we can't prove, but which are given objective reality for practical purposes. They don't extend our speculative knowledge of the world, but they are a necessary need of pure practical reason. They allow morality to be a rational enterprise.
So, moving from the purely metaphysical to the more worldly, how did this whole structure influence Kant's political philosophy?
It had a huge influence. He was a great Enlightenment thinker who was deeply concerned with securing perpetual peace on Earth.
A cosmopolitan vision.
Very much so. He believed that lasting peace wasn't possible through simple treaties, but only through an international federation of republican states, a kind of League of Nations governed by law.
And he was very specific about what a republican state meant. It wasn't just about who rules.
Right, he distinguished the form of sovereignty, who holds power, a monarch, an aristocracy, or the people from the form of government, how that power is wielded, either republican or despotic. For Kant, any legitimate government had to be republican.
Meaning it's based on principles of freedom, dependence on a common law, and legal equality. Governance by law, not by arbitrary will.
Exactly. And this is why he was famously critical of what he called democracy in the strict sense.
What we might call direct democracy.
Yes, a system with no separation of powers. He believed it was necessarily a despotism because, in his words, all decide for and, if need be, against one. It creates a situation where the will of the majority can trample the rights of the minority, which he saw as a contradiction of the general will and freedom itself.
Okay, finally, we have to address a deeply problematic and contested part of his legacy. Something modern scholarship really has to grapple with. His views on race.
It's an essential piece of context, and it's important to be clear. Kant was one of the most intellectually significant thinkers of his era to not just observe racial differences, but to actively defend and create a full-blown theory of race, which he used to classify and hierarchize humanity.
So he used his philosophical authority to, in effect, legitimize racist ideas.
That's the argument critics make, and the textual evidence is pretty stark. His anthropological writings contain very clear hierarchical categorizations. For example, he wrote that white Europeans contain all the impulses of nature, all talents, all dispositions to culture and civilization.
And he placed other groups far below that.
Drastically lower. He wrote that Native Americans were far below the Negro, who undoubtedly holds the lowest of all remaining levels. He also claimed that Black Africans can be educated, but only as servants, and that they can be disciplined and cultivated, but as never genuinely civilized.
Those are, without question, statements of extreme systematic prejudice. And it's so hard to square that with the philosopher who gave us the categorical imperative, the command to treat all humanity as an end in itself.
And that is the core of the scholarly debate today. There is complexity. The sources do indicate he significantly altered his views later in life, moving away from a strict biological concept of race. But for much of his active career, these highly influential racist theories were taught and published.
So the question that remains, and it's a deeply contested one, is to what degree this aspect of his thought degrades or even invalidates the supposed universality of his other contributions.
It's a question without an easy answer.
All right, let's try to bring this monumental deep dive to a close and summarize the central takeaways from Kant's universe.
Okay, I think we can distill it down to 4 main points.
Go for it.
1. The Great Divide. Kant establishes that we can never know things in themselves, the noumenon. All human knowledge is limited to the world of appearances, the phenomena which is structured by our own minds.
2. The moral engine. Morality isn't about feelings or consequences. It's rooted in the rational will's capacity for self-legislation autonomy. And this is expressed through the categorical imperative. Treat humanity as an end, never merely as a means.
3. Freedom is real. The moral law is revealed as a fact of reason that proves the reality of transcendental freedom. This freedom, though we can't explain it theoretically, is the keystone of the whole moral system, the ground of all responsibility.
And finally, 4. Faith is rational. Our moral duty to pursue the highest good requires us to rationally assume the immortality of the soul and the existence of God as practical postulates. It makes faith a rational necessity for a moral life.
That's a pretty good summary.
That brings us to our final provocative thought. Kant saw true moral worth as being completely separate from personal satisfaction. He asks you to imagine an upright person who has done their duty, even if it has cost them everything, their friends, their fortune, their health.
And Kant argues that the inner peace that person might feel, that consolation, is not happiness, not even the smallest part of it. It's actually something merely negative.
What does he mean by negative?
He says it's only warding off the danger of sinking in personal worth.
Wow. So the ultimate takeaway is that the dignity of being a moral agent, the consciousness of having maintained humanity in its proper dignity, is a reward entirely separate from and superior to happiness. It's an unflinching commitment to worth, even when the world offers nothing in return. That's the uncompromising demand of the Kantian moral universe.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into one of history's most influential thinkers.
We'll catch you next time for more essential insights.